I heard my father before I saw him. It was the same voice that used to call me in for dinner when I was a girl, firm, certain, the kind that expected the world to line up neatly behind it. Only now it echoed through a packed hall of uniforms and families floating above the low murmurs like a claim he still believed belonged to him. She dropped out of the Navy, he said to someone nearby, not whispered, not said with regret. Said like a fact he'd stamped and filed away years ago. Couldn't handle it. But my boy now, he's a different story. For a moment my body reacted the way it always had, a tightening in my chest, that small, familiar ache behind the ribs, not anger. Anger burns too hot and too fast. This was older than that. This felt like weather you've lived through so many times you stop checking the forecast. I stood at the back of the hall with my hands folded, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. Civilian clothes, no uniform, no insignia, no medals. If anyone glanced my way, they'd see a woman in late middle age who blended easily into any American crowd, maybe a teacher, maybe a nurse. Maybe someone's aunt who brought casseroles to church potlucks and listened more than she talked. That was the point. I'd spent most of my adult life learning how to be invisible when visibility served no purpose, how to sit still when people expected a reaction, how to keep my face calm when words tried to provoke an answer out of me. Silence had become a kind of armor, quiet, disciplined, dependable. On the stage, flags stood at attention, their fabric barely moving in the conditioned air. The seats were nearly full. Families held printed programs in their laps like hymnals. The room smelled like polished floors and pressed fabric. Duty and anticipation mixed into something almost sacred. Ceremonies like this don't feel like entertainment. They feel like something holy to the people who understand what it costs. My brother was going to be honored that day, and he deserved it. I was there for him. I was there because I'd promised myself long ago that bitterness would never decide what kind of sister I became. The band quieted. A voice called the room to order. People straightened in their chairs. A hush settled over the crowd, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. And then, just before the ceremony truly began, the general stepped into view. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged in his own skin. His uniform was impeccable. But it wasn't the fabric that commanded attention. It was the weight he carried, the invisible authority that comes from years of decisions that mattered. He scanned the room the way leaders do, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. Front row, second row, parents, dignitaries, smiles, nerves, pride held carefully in check. His gaze moved like a slow spotlight, and then it reached the back. It reached me. Our eyes met. There was no confusion in his expression, no searching look, just recognition. The kind that lands quietly, like a hand on your shoulder, as if to say, "I see you." He paused, just a fraction. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I noticed everything. I always had. Then, in a tone so calm it almost blended into the silence, he said, "Rear Admiral, you're here," for a heartbeat. The hall stopped breathing. The air felt heavier, not because the words were loud, but because they were undeniable. 200 SEALs rose to their feet in one clean motion, not chaotic, not startled, disciplined, reflexive. Like a single body responding to a command it didn't need to be given. Chairs scraped softly, fabric shifted, boots aligned. The sound wasn't a roar, it was a wave. A sudden, unified surge of respect that washed through the room and left stunned quiet behind it. I didn't flinch, I didn't smile, I didn't lift a hand to my chest the way people do in movies. I simply stood, slowly, because returning respect matters, and because I would not turn that moment into performance. Behind me, I felt my father go still. When I turned my head slightly, I saw him frozen in place, his face drained of color, not the look of a man who'd been outsmarted. The look of a man whose story had just collapsed in front of witnesses. My mother sat beside him, eyes wide, one hand half raised to her mouth like she'd caught herself mid-breath. Her expression wasn't anger, it was shock, layered with something else, recognition. And my brother, he stood on the floor with the other candidates, face composed, as trained, but his eyes searching. He looked out into the crowd the way a man does when something in his world shifts without warning. When his gaze reached the back row, he frowned. Like he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been told his whole life. I knew what he was thinking. I didn't blame him. He was raised under the same roof, heard the same stories. The difference was he'd never needed to question them. He'd been the hero in my father's version of the world. I was the quiet footnote. For years my father had been a respected man in our community. Church every Sunday, same pew, pastor's hand firmly shaken. He made sure people knew his family valued service. He wasn't cruel. That was what made it harder. He was simply certain in a way that left no room for nuance, no room for questions. When I was young, I was the child who did what she was told and didn't ask for attention. If there was a choice between speaking and listening, I listened. My brother filled rooms without trying. Teachers praised him, coaches slapped his back. My father saw himself in him, bold, visible, undeniable. I joined the Navy for reasons I never fully explained to my family, not because they wouldn't have understood. Because they never made space to ask. I didn't join for glory, I joined for structure, for purpose, for a life built on responsibility instead of approval. My path didn't look like my brother's, and it didn't make for proud storytelling over coffee after church. Over time, my silence became an inconvenience. To my father, he didn't like not knowing. So instead of admitting it, he filled in the blanks with something simpler. Something he could repeat without fear of being corrected. She dropped out. It was easier than saying, "I don't know what my daughter does," easier than admitting. A quiet life can still be powerful, easier than acknowledging that some service is invisible by necessity, not by failure. The general held my gaze a moment longer. Then he nodded once and turned back to the ceremony. He didn't explain, he didn't elaborate. That was his own form of respect. In my world, you don't turn someone's life into a speech without permission. And just like that, the ceremony went on. Flags, cadence, formal words, while something deeper rippled under the surface of every face in the room. I had come to sit quietly and watch my brother be honored. I hadn't come to be seen. But sometimes the truth doesn't ask what you came for. Sometimes it just arrives, steady, calm, undeniable, and stands on its own as the seals sat back down and the ceremony continued. I stayed standing a beat longer than necessary, not for drama, because my legs suddenly felt the weight of everything I'd carried quietly. Then I eased back into my seat in the last row, hands folded again, face composed, as if my heart hadn't just been reminded how long I'd lived inside other people's assumptions. My father didn't look back. He didn't need to. The truth had found him without my help. People think that if you wear a uniform long enough, you stop feeling things. That's not true. You just learn what to do with the feelings. You set them aside until the job is done. You breathe through them. You keep your posture steady. And then you carry on. Later, when you're alone, when the noise fades and the room finally exhales, that's when you let yourself remember. I joined the Navy right out of college. At a time when everyone around me seemed to be choosing comfort, getting married, young, finding safe jobs close to home, settling into routines they could explain neatly over Sunday lunch. I wasn't looking for danger, I was looking for purpose. I wanted a life where hard work meant something real, where discipline wasn't a personality trait, but a standard, where responsibility wasn't optional. My father didn't like the idea at first. He liked tradition. Yes, but only when it fit his expectations. He was proud of service when it came with stories he could tell, stories that sounded heroic over coffee after church. My brother had already been talking about seals like they were carved out of legend, and my father loved that. It was clean, dramatic, easy to understand. I was different. I filled out forms quietly. I made decisions without fanfare the day I left for training. My father hugged me and said, "Don't make a fool of yourself," like it was half a joke. My mother cried softly into a dish towel in the kitchen. My brother teased me for being the serious one, then hugged me longer than he meant to at officer candidate school. The Navy introduced me to a truth that shaped my entire life. There are many kinds of strength, and not all of them shout. Some people thrive on visible tests, mile runs, obstacle courses, the kind of hardship you can point to and say, "See, I did that." I respected those people. I admired them, but I noticed something else too. The Navy didn't run on bravado. It ran on planning, on coordination, on discipline that didn't need an audience. I gravitated toward the work that made the visible triumphs possible. I studied logistics because I learned quickly that courage is useless without fuel, without timing, without supplies arriving where they're needed when they're needed. I leaned into intelligence and strategy because I saw what happens when decisions are made on pride instead of facts. I trained in rooms where the most important sentence you could say was, "We don't know yet," followed by the harder work of finding out. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing my father would brag about. But it was the kind of work that kept people alive. My first assignments taught me how quickly life can turn on details. A shipment delayed, a plan misunderstood, a piece of information misread. In windowless rooms with fluorescent lights humming like tired bees, I watched how real leaders listened, how they asked questions, how they weighed consequences. And I learned something personal, too. The more responsibility you carry, the less you talk about it. Phone calls home became complicated. At first, I tried. I wanted my family to feel included. But I couldn't answer basic questions. Where are you? What are you doing? When will you be home? The truth was, I often didn't know the last one myself, and even when I did, I couldn't always say it out loud. So I kept things simple. "I'm fine," I'd tell my mother, "just busy." My father heard that as avoidance. He liked explanations. He liked neat narratives. Silence made him itchy, like a tag in the back of a shirt, and the quieter I stayed, the more he assumed I must have something to hide. When I missed Thanksgiving one year because of unexpected tasking, his disappointment turned sharp. "Your brother would have found a way," he said. I didn't argue. My brother wasn't in my lane, I wasn't in his. Comparing us was like comparing a fireman to an air traffic controller. Both necessary, both different. Only one fit my father's idea of heroism. The missed milestones piled up quietly. A cousin's wedding I couldn't attend, a birthday dinner I apologized for, a Christmas where my mother set a place for me anyway, then cried when it stayed empty. Each time I swallowed the urge to over-explain, because the truth was larger than I could share. Eventually, my father stopped asking. Instead, he started telling. I learned later, in fragments, the way you learn family legends you never consented to. A neighbor once asked me, gently, if I was doing okay after leaving the Navy. An aunt patted my hand at a funeral and said, "You tried, sweetheart. That's what matters." Even my brother once joked on a rare call, "Dad says you didn't like getting yelled at." I didn't correct him, not because I didn't care, because I understood how stories grow legs when no one stops them, and because part of my discipline was learning when silence served something larger than my ego. Still, there were nights, hotel rooms between flights, highways whispering outside the window. And I wondered what it would have felt like to be known. Not praised, not praised, just known, to have a father who asked questions instead of writing conclusions in ink. My career moved the way a quiet river moves, steady, persistent, carving through stone without asking anyone to clap. Promotions came with more responsibility and fewer explanations. I accepted roles that required discretion, roles where the safest thing for everyone involved was for me to say less, not more. I didn't wear my life like a billboard, I wore it like a duty. By the time my brother's name started circulating in conversations about elite training and SEAL selection, my own path had already slipped into a realm my father wouldn't have known how to talk about, even if he'd wanted to. So when the invitation to that ceremony arrived, and I chose to attend silently, it wasn't because I was afraid of being seen. It was because I'd spent a lifetime learning that the truest work doesn't beg for recognition, it just shows up when it matters most. The morning of the ceremony carried that strange quiet only important days have. The sky was pale blue, stretched thin over the base, like it too was holding its breath. I arrived early, not from nerves, from habit. Years of service had trained me to value empty rooms before they filled, to read spaces before voices changed their shape. The hall stood solid and unadorned, built for function, not beauty. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and pressed fabric. Order, flags were already posted with exacting precision. Rows of chairs waited in quiet formation, gaps between them so perfect they looked intentional. I chose a seat near the back, slightly off-center. From there, I could see everything, without being seen myself. I wore a simple navy blazer, neutral slacks, sensible shoes. No jewelry beyond the watch I'd worn for years, no pins, no insignia. If anyone glanced my way, I'd register as just another family member, someone's sister. A cousin who'd flown in and would fly out again. Families filtered in, voices hushed but excited. Mothers clutched programs like lifelines. Fathers stood straighter than usual, pride barely contained, laughter stayed respectful. Everyone understood they were stepping into something earned. My parents arrived together. My father wore the same dark suit he reserved for church and funerals. Tie straight, shoulders squared, he moved through the room with ease, greeting people with firm handshakes. This was his element, a public space where pride could be shared and validated. I watched him without resentment. Observation had long replaced judgment in me. My son's a SEAL, he told one man, voice warm and confident, took everything they threw at him. The man nodded. Impressed, my father smiled, basking in it. Then, as naturally as breathing, he added, my daughter tried the Navy once. Dropped out, different temperament. The man murmured something polite. The conversation drifted on. The words landed the way they always did, dull, familiar. What still surprised me was how easily they were spoken, how comfortably my father wore a story built on assumptions. I didn't turn around, I didn't tense, I just reminded myself, some truths take their time. Here's a clean, polished continuation of your story segment, keeping the same tone, pacing, and emotional weight, while tightening language and correcting flow, something I'd learned early. You can't correct a narrative in a room that isn't listening for the truth, and this room wasn't here for me. The ceremony began with the quiet authority of tradition. A command rang out, the room rose, the band played, crisp, measured, practiced. When everyone sat again, the stillness that followed felt earned. My brother stood with the other candidates at the front, posture straight, eyes forward. He looked exactly as he should, focused, composed, contained. Training had stripped away excess and left only what mattered. In that moment, he wasn't my brother or my father's pride. He was a sailor who had endured something most people never would. I felt nothing but respect for him. The general entered next, his presence shifting the room without a word. He moved with an ease that only long familiarity with command creates. Not hurried, not stiff, simply assured. His uniform was immaculate, but it wasn't the medals or the rank that quieted the space. It was the way he carried responsibility, as if it had settled into his bones. He took his place at the podium and began. His voice was calm and deliberate. He spoke about commitment, about discipline, about the kind of perseverance that doesn't announce itself. His words weren't embellished, they didn't need to be. Everyone in the room understood what had been required to reach this moment. As he spoke, his gaze moved across the audience, parents, families, dignitaries, faces tight with pride, nerves, gratitude. His eyes traveled slowly, methodically, the way leaders read rooms without realizing they're doing it. When his gaze reached the back, it paused. Just a fraction of a second. Our eyes met. There was no surprise in his expression. No searching, just recognition, quiet, certain, the kind that comes from shared context, shared responsibility. He inclined his head almost imperceptibly. I returned the gesture the same restrained way. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Achievements acknowledged. The cadence of the event flowed smoothly, each part clicking into place like a well-rehearsed operation. I let myself be present, listening not just to the words, but to what they meant. This was the visible edge of a much larger system, one that relied as much on unseen decisions as on public acts of courage. I thought about the rooms I'd spent years in, windowless, secure, quiet. Maps spread across tables, plans revised at the last minute, conversations held in low voices because lives depended on accuracy. I thought about how rarely anyone outside those rooms would ever know how close things had come to going wrong, or how deliberately they'd been steered right. Halfway through the ceremony, my father leaned toward my mother and whispered something. She smiled, eyes never leaving the stage. Pride radiated from her in a softer way than his, less verbal, more constant. She had always been like that. The general reached the closing portion of the ceremony. His tone shifted slightly, not louder, not heavier, just more deliberate. He paused, adjusted the microphone, scanned the room once more. This unit represents the best of what service can look like, he said. But service doesn't always wear the same uniform, and it doesn't always stand at the front. A ripple of attention moved through the audience. He looked toward the back again. Before we conclude, he said evenly, "I'd like to acknowledge a colleague in attendance." People glanced around, confused, curious. My father's head tilted slightly, as if trying to anticipate where this was going. The general's eyes held mine. "Rear Admiral," he said, voice clear and respectful, "you're here." For a heartbeat, the room didn't react. And then, as if moved by a single unspoken command, 200 SEALs rose to their feet. Chairs shifted in unison. Fabric moved, boots aligned. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a disciplined response born of instinct and tradition. I remained seated for a brief moment, not out of defiance, but grounding. Then I stood slowly, returning respect without ceremony. I met the general's gaze and nodded once. He nodded back just as simply. Behind me, I felt the air change. When I turned my head slightly, I saw my father frozen in place, his face drained of color. The story he had told for years had nowhere left to stand. The general resumed the ceremony without further comment. No explanation, no elaboration. The truth had been spoken. That was enough. The sound of chairs settling back into place came slowly, unevenly, as if the room needed a moment to remember how to breathe again. Protocol resumed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it. The ceremony moved forward. Yet the air felt denser, charged with a realization no one had anticipated. I stood still for another second, feeling the weight of the moment settle fully into my body. Years of training had taught me this. Reactions matter less than restraint. I straightened my jacket, a small, unconscious gesture, and eased back into my seat near the rear wall. From there, I could see both the stage and the ripple the general's words had left behind. The men at the front stood straighter now, if that was even possible. They didn't whisper. They didn't look round. But awareness moved through them like a current. They understood hierarchy, they understood respect, and they understood exactly what had just been acknowledged. The general continued in a calm, even voice, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. That too was intentional. Authority doesn't linger on itself. It states what is true and moves. On. My brother remained forward-facing, disciplined, eyes locked ahead, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the subtle shift that betrayed confusion. He had trained himself to hold focus under stress, but this wasn't operational stress. This was personal. This was family. I didn't look at him for long. That moment wasn't about us yet. Behind me, my father still hadn't moved. When I finally turned my head slightly, I saw him sitting rigidly, hands pressed flat against his thighs. His mouth was slightly open, as if words had been forming there and then abandoned him. His face, so often animated with certainty, was pale, stripped of its usual color and confidence. For the first time I could remember, my father looked unsure of what story he was standing in. I felt no satisfaction in that. No vindication. If anything, I felt a quiet heaviness. Truth, when it arrives without warning, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like loss. The loss of an illusion you didn't realize you were relying on. The ceremony concluded with the same dignity it had begun. Final words were spoken. Commands given, applause followed, measured, respectful, earned. The men on stage were congratulated, recognized, photographed. Families rose and pressed forward, smiles breaking through the restraint that had held them in check for the last hour. I remained seated until the first wave passed. Old habits again. You don't rush into noise when you don't need to. Eventually, I stood and stepped aside, allowing others to move around me. A few officers approached. Not with curiosity, with acknowledgement, a nod, a brief handshake. Mum, nothing more. They didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done. In our world, that kind of questioning would have been inappropriate. Recognition doesn't require explanation. The general passed by on his way down from the stage. He stopped briefly, just long enough to offer a quiet word. I'm glad you could be here, he said. So am I replied. That was all. We didn't need more. Across the room, my brother finally turned. His eyes found mine. And for a moment, the distance between us, years of different paths, different understandings, felt suddenly visible. He excused himself from a group of fellow candidates and made his way toward me, stopping a few feet away. Is it true? He asked softly. There was no accusation in his voice, just honest confusion. Yes, I said. He exhaled. I learned something early in life. You can't fix a story in a room that isn't listening for the truth, and that room wasn't there for me. The ceremony unfolded with the quiet authority of tradition. A command cut through the air. Everyone stood. The band played, crisp and measured, every note practiced into place. When we sat again, the silence felt earned, like the room itself had taken a breath. My brother stood at the front with the other candidates, back straight, eyes forward, exactly as he should be. Training had stripped him down to the essentials, leaving only discipline and resolve. In that moment, he wasn't my little brother. He wasn't even my father's pride. He was a sailor who had endured something most people never would, and all I felt for him was respect. Then the general entered. He didn't rush. He didn't stiffen. He moved the way men move when command has lived in their bones for decades. His uniform was immaculate, but it wasn't the medals that quieted the room. It was the weight of responsibility he carried so naturally, like gravity followed him. He spoke about commitment, about discipline, about perseverance that doesn't announce itself. His voice was calm, deliberate. No theatrics, no embellishment. He didn't need any. Everyone in that room understood what it had taken to get here. As he spoke, his eyes moved across the audience, parents, families. Faces tight with pride and nerves and gratitude, he read the room the way leaders do, without realizing they're doing it. When his gaze reached the back, it paused, just for a fraction of a second. Our eyes met. There was no surprise in his expression, no searching, just recognition. Quiet, certain. The kind that comes from shared context and shared responsibility. He inclined his head almost imperceptibly. I returned the gesture. The ceremony continued, names called, achievements acknowledged. Everything flowed like a well-rehearsed operation. I listened not just to the words, but to what they meant. This was the visible edge of a much larger system. One built as much on unseen decisions as on public courage. I thought about the rooms I'd spent years in, windowless, secure, maps spread across tables. Plans revised at the last minute, conversations held in low voices because lives depended on accuracy. I thought about how rarely anyone outside those rooms would ever know how close things had come to breaking, or how carefully they'd been steered back into place. Halfway through, my father leaned toward my mother and whispered something. She smiled, eyes still on the stage. Pride radiated from her in a softer way than his. Less verbal, more constant, the general's tone shifted. Near the end. Not louder, just more deliberate. This unit represents the best of what service can look like, he said. But service doesn't always wear the same uniform. And it doesn't always stand at the front. A ripple of attention moved through the room. He looked toward the back again. Before we conclude, he said evenly, I'd like to acknowledge a colleague in attendance. People glanced around, curious, confused. My father tilted his head slightly. The general's eyes locked onto mine. Rear Admiral, he said, clear and respectful, you're here for a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then 200 SEALs rose to their feet. Chairs shifted in unison. Fabric moved, boots aligned. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I stayed seated for one brief moment, not out of defiance, out of grounding. Then I stood. I nodded once. The general nodded back. Behind me, the air changed. When I turned slightly, my father was frozen, his face drained of color. The story he'd told for years had nowhere left to stand. The general continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, no explanation, no elaboration. The truth had been spoken. That was enough. The chair settled back slowly, unevenly. Like the room needed to remember how to breathe. Something fundamental had shifted. My brother stood straighter than ever, eyes locked forward. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, confusion, personal, family deep. My father sat rigid. Hands pressed flat to his thighs, mouth slightly open. The man who once filled rooms with certainty now looked unsure what story he was standing in. I felt no vindication, only a quiet heaviness. Truth, when it arrives without warning, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like loss. The ceremony ended with dignity, applause. Smiles breaking through restraint, families surged. Forward, I stayed seated. Old habits, officers approached. A nod, a handshake, ma'am, nothing more. No questions, no curiosity. The general stopped beside me. I'm glad you could be here. So am I said, across the room. My brother turned, our eyes met. Years of different paths suddenly visible. Is it true? He asked softly. Yes, he exhaled slowly. I didn't know. I know. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because my work wasn't something I could explain. And after a while, it didn't feel necessary to try. He hugged me, brief, controlled, sincere. You deserved to be seen, he said. This wasn't about that, I told him. Today is yours, outside. The afternoon sun lay warm. Across the pavement, families laughed, phones rose, life moved forward. I sat in my car before starting the engine, looked at my reflection, older now, marked by years of decisions without applause. Sometimes the truth doesn't wait for permission. That night, my father called. I didn't know, he said, his voice unsteady. I know, I told people things I shouldn't have. I never corrected you, I said gently, but that doesn't mean it didn't matter. He paused. I was wrong, and for the first time, that was enough. Days later, he asked me to dinner. Not as a demand, not as an expectation, as an invitation. Some conversations need distance before they can be honest, and some truths don't arrive with force. Sometimes they simply stand quietly and wait to be acknowledged. At the same angle, it struck me how places can stay exactly the same while the people inside them slowly drift apart, and sometimes, if they're lucky, find their way back. My parents' house looked just as it always had, the lawn trimmed, the porch light already on, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. My father's habit, better to see what's coming. When I stepped inside, the smell of cooking wrapped around me. Warm and familiar, my mother hugged me gently, holding on a second longer than usual. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her eyes told me she'd been carrying her own quiet questions for years. My father stood near the kitchen table, hands loosely clasped in front of him. He looked older than he had at the ceremony, or maybe just less armored. We sat down to eat. Nothing fancy, the same kind of meal that had sustained our family for decades. Conversation stayed on safe ground at first: traffic, weather, my brothers, plans, a neighbor's new grandchild. My father listened more than he spoke. Halfway through, he set his fork down. I've been thinking, he said. I waited. I kept telling myself that if something mattered, you would have said something. That silence meant there was nothing to say. I took a slow breath. Silence can mean a lot of things, I said. Sometimes it means trust, sometimes it means boundaries. He nodded. I didn't see that. I saw quiet and thought it meant failure. That's because not knowing made you uncomfortable, I said gently. So you filled the space. He looked down at his hands. I did. My mother reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He squeezed it once, then looked back at me. I told people you dropped out, he said. I said it like it was fact. Yes, I replied. I was wrong, he said again, firmer this time. And I'm sorry. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth. I'm not angry, I told him. But it mattered. Words travel farther than we think. He swallowed. I see that now. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It felt honest. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. What did you do? He asked. I don't need details. I just want to understand. I chose my words carefully. I served in ways that weren't meant to be seen. I said, I helped make sure other people could do their jobs safely. I made decisions that didn't come with applause. He nodded slowly. That sounds important. It was, I said, and it required silence. He leaned back, absorbing that. I thought being proud meant talking, he said. Turns out it might mean listening. That's a good lesson, I said. At any age, he gave a small, rueful smile. I wish I'd learned it sooner. So do I said, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Old photo albums sat on the coffee table, their spines worn thin from years of being pulled down and put back. My father flipped through pictures of birthdays, holidays, school events. There were gaps, years where I appeared only once or twice, always smiling politely, always leaving early. I didn't ask then either. He said quietly, "No," I agreed, "but I can ask now." "Yes," I said. He looked up at me. "I'm proud of you. Not because of rank, because you stayed yourself." Something in my chest loosened. Recognition doesn't always come from being seen publicly. Sometimes it comes from being understood privately. When it was time to leave, my father walked me to the door. The porch light cast a familiar glow across the steps. "I won't tell that story anymore," he said, "about you quitting." "I know," I replied, "and if people ask, tell them I served." I said, "That's enough." He nodded, "That's enough." As I drove away, I realized something. Reconciliation isn't about rewriting the past, it's about agreeing to tell the truth moving forward. Retirement didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, papers signed, responsibilities handed over, quiet goodbyes in hallways where no one lingered too long. The Navy doesn't celebrate endings the way civilians imagine. You step aside, and the work continues in the weeks after. My final day, I kept waking early out of habit. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. I brewed coffee and sat in the quiet. For the first time in decades, there was space to reflect without checking a watch. That's when I understood what that ceremony had really given me. Not recognition, not vindication, clarity. My father adjusted slowly, sincerely, when neighbors asked about me. He didn't reach for shortcuts. My daughter served for many years, he'd say, sometimes in ways we didn't always understand. He said it without embarrassment, without boasting. Just respect. One afternoon, we sat on the porch watching cars pass. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "I used to think the loudest people were the strongest. I waited. Now I think the strongest ones are the ones who don't need to be loud at all." I smiled, not because it was profound, but because it was learned. My brother visited not long after. Out of uniform, he looked lighter. Before he left, he said, "I've been telling some of the younger guys something." "What's that?" "That not all heroes stand at the front. Some stand behind the map." As time passed, I began speaking to small groups, veterans, families, young officers, not to tell my story, just to say something simple. That service doesn't always announce itself, that some careers are built on silence, that worth isn't measured by how often your name is spoken. People nodded. Some looked relieved. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's this: don't speak for someone whose path you never asked about. Silence isn't failure. Often it's discipline. Often it's trust. And if you're the one who stayed quiet, who carried responsibility without recognition, your life doesn't need witnesses to be valid. Truth has a way of standing up on its own. The day my father introduced me simply as his daughter, no rank, no correction, no story attached, something finally settled into place. Some victories arrive without cheering. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn, but they are no less real for coming quietly.